If you want to improve your golf game, it's fair to say that learning some club face control would be beneficial, particularly the skill of squaring the club face at impact on a consistent basis. And the information you'll find in this video will help you to do just that. Whether or not you're currently someone who suffers with an open club face and slices the ball excessively, or if you're someone who has the opposite problem of having a club face that's too closed, hitting erratic hook shots. Whatever it is, we'll use some key checkpoints throughout the swing and explain to you some drills that you can do next time you're at the driving range to really improve this skill. The skill of controlling this club head and club face is quite a difficult one to master because the club head itself is changing its orientation throughout the entire swing. But if you learn one thing today, it would be that the wrists control the club face, and what you do with your wrists matters. Most of you are completely unaware of the fact that you're twisting this club around in space as you swing this club around you. You don't even realize that you're doing it. And that's because what you've learned to do is something that's very natural to you. I'm going to explain to you how the twisting and the rotation of the wrists immediately and directly influences the twisting of the club face. And it's this club face's orientation which really makes a difference in terms of the direction of your shots. One of the first pieces I would often tend to look at would be the setup, particularly the grip, because the way you grip the club has a tremendous influence on how you rotate and twist this golf club. But for this video, I'm going to leave the grip till the end. And if you watch till the end, you'll understand why. Because the grip really gives you options as far as how you hold the club based on your particular problem. So we will come back to the grip a little bit later on. The first checkpoint I'm really going to share with you would be in the backswing, where the club head and the shaft here is parallel to the ground. And in the takeaway of the swing, oftentimes golfers can get the twisting of the club wrong as early as this point right here. The rotation of the club face at this point is directly influenced by the twisting of the wrist. The wrist twisting down, putting the club face into a more closed position, would be described as flexion of the lead wrist, twisting the wrist down. That would make the club face as closed as possible. And the opposite movement of that would be to extend the lead wrist, move it into this cupped condition, which has an effect of rotating this club face pretty much 180 degrees. So when filming your swing, you can check when the club's in the backswing that the leading edge of the golf club there, the club face itself, has a slightly downward angle to it. The club face or the grooves here would not be vertical. They would be turned down towards the ground some 15 to 20 degrees. That would be considered neutral. So if you see your club head in this position at this point, you're probably in good shape. That being said, things can still go wrong from here, but this would be the first place to check if you're struggling with club face control. The second checkpoint would be the top of the backswing. Based on having a relatively neutral grip, which I said we'll come to later, the top of the backswing, we'd look to get this lead wrist into a fairly flat condition, meaning that the back of my hand and my forearm are on a same or similar plane. Incorrect wrist condition at the top of the backswing would look like this for the extension, the slicer if you like. The person who has the club face too open would have the wrist cupped in this condition right here. And the golfer who hits it to the left or hooks would actually tend to find that they've flexed the wrist too much, bowing it into this condition and closing the club face excessively. So the second checkpoint you can look for here is for the left wrist to be flat at the top of the backswing. The next checkpoint is a little harder to see unless you're filming your swing because it happens in the downswing. We're going to go back to this checkpoint right here where the shaft's parallel to the ground, but in this occasion we're on the way down and heading back to the ball. Once again, we'd be looking for a similar alignment where the club face is turned down slightly and the toe of the club is slightly ahead of the heel there. That would be considered to be quite neutral. Once again, I see lots and lots of players who have the club in a good place at the start of the swing. They still have it in a good place at the top, but in pulling the club down and beginning to put power into their stroke, they twist this club unknowingly, either too open or too closed, and find themselves suffering with no directional control at all. So if you're able to film your swing, the checkpoint here where the shaft's parallel to the ground is a really good one to look at, because you may find that the answer to your problems lies in this picture right here. If you have something that's too closed, you'd look to feel the toe of the club more vertical. And equally, if you had something that was too open, where this club face was pointing up to the sky, you'd be training yourself to twist the club head more down towards the ground. Let's take those checkpoints and discuss some drills in a little bit more detail using the Hack Motion wrist sensor to help us see some of that twisting with data that we may not be able to see with the naked eye. I'll start with the setup, and when we take my normal grip, and remember I'll come back to the grip later as far as your options, but my grip's quite neutral. I would consider my grip to be pretty decent in terms of it being neutral. It's not too strong or too weak. And so with my neutral grip, I have a little bit of lead wrist extension, meaning there's a small amount of angle in my lead wrist that's set up. There's about 18 or 19, even 20 degrees there. And by the time I reach shaft parallel in the backswing and I make my takeaway, you're going to see that that number of flexion extension has changed from 20 degrees of extension to 5, 6, 7 degrees of flexion. That's a 25 to 30 degree twist of my wrist. And yet, during that part of the swing there, I don't feel that twist at all. But it's happening. We can see that it's happening because it's being measured. And the reason I don't feel that is because I'm so used to that movement that it's become natural to me. And the thing that you're doing in your swing, as I've already mentioned, is the movements you're making with your wrist are so natural to you, you don't even consider that they might be wrong. But I promise you, you are already twisting this club. And if you're struggling with this directional control, whether it be those weak slices or those uncontrollable hooks, you're twisting this club incorrectly. So when you do come to try these drills, it's really important that you consider yourself to taking the swing to the point where you twist it in a way that feels alien to you. That's very necessary. You're not doing the same thing, because if you are, you're going to get the same results. You need to change the way this thing feels. So I think that's quite interesting to go from 20 degrees of extension to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees of flexion, 25 degrees again, of twisting this club down towards the ground in the first part of the swing. If I take my setup again, that 20 degrees of extension, and kept 20 degrees of extension at the same point in time, there we go, 20, 19, 20 degrees of extension. Look at the position of that club face where the shaft's parallel to the ground. It's already pointing up to the sky. That's a picture I would associate with someone who slices the ball. It's a picture I would associate with a bunker shot where you're trying to hit the ball very high. But someone who struggles with distance and hitting the ball to the right would also be someone who has a club face that's consistent with this. And all I did there was maintain the same amount of extension in my lead wrist that I had at setup into the backswing. That should tell you straight away that you need to be feeling a twisting of this club in order to control the club face. Setting up again, we're back at 20 degrees of extension, and I take this thing to the top. I've got that lead wrist pretty much flat. The flexion number there reads 3 degrees of flexion. So I've got that lead wrist flat. There's no excessive extension. This would be 50 degrees of extension, super open club face. This would be excessive flexion, 30 degrees of it for flexion, and a very closed club face. I told you to look for that flat wrist. That isn't going to be applicable to everybody because of your grip, which again, I'll come to later. But it's a good baseline for you to look for at the top of your swing. If your grip and your forearm, the back of your hand and your forearm are flat, you're probably doing a reasonable job of this club face control at this point in time. Anything with too much extension, you're likely to have the club face too open, and too much of the bowing or the flexion would tend to make the club face more closed. So the left wrist checkpoint there at the top of the swing can be a very useful one to keep an eye on. And we'll take that flat left wrist at the top and move it back down towards the ball. Again, it's staying flat. That 3 degrees of flexion that I had in the backswing, at the top, and now into the downswing, I'm able to maintain. That shows that my wrist condition's very stable. I'm not letting this thing fly around in space and change its orientation too excessively. So holding that wrist angle, keeping the left wrist very flat at this point in time is going to be something that you'd want to look for. Again, if you struggle with hitting the ball to the right as a slicer, your club face is too open, you would be encouraged to twist this club face down even more the feeling that you might need in order to produce a square club face is that you need to feel like it's more closed. Something like this might be applicable if you're really struggling to hit those shots that don't go too far to the right. So twisting the club face beyond what you think is necessary is all part of the exploration here in terms of finding that feel that's personal to you. The same would be true if you're someone who hooks the ball. You'd want to come down, and rather than having this club face too closed, you'd actually be looking to work this club face much more vertical. That could be a feeling of keeping your thumbs more on top of the grip rather than letting them get down to the side. Keeping the thumbs on top would tend to keep the club face itself more vertical. And as we've already said, that's associated with a little bit more extension and a little bit more of an open club face. The final drill I want to share with you today involves the follow through. This is one of my favorite drills to really learn to square the club face correctly. A lot of people get confused with how this club's supposed to move through impact. There's people telling you to roll your wrists over and try to square the face that way. I certainly wouldn't conform or agree with that information at all. The club face, when it hits the ball, does not need to be rolling or twisting over. In fact, one of my favorite drills is to stop the club where it's parallel to the ground, the shaft is parallel to the ground in the follow through. And a checkpoint you'd look for here would be that the leading edge of the club at this point is basically vertical, okay, pretty much straight up and down, and that the shaft of the club, the shaft of your club, has not overtaken your lead arm. So there's no overtaking or roll. It's this movement that ironically is told to so many golfers that causes them to swing across the ball and slice. You want to keep the shaft behind the lead arm, and you want to keep the club face at this point more or less straight up and down. That would be considered pretty neutral. Again, you could come through the ball here, and I see a lot of golfers struggle with this movement because you're trying to lean the shaft. We'll talk about leaning the shaft. Because you're trying to lean the shaft forward at impact because you're told that's a good thing, and I would agree that is a good thing, you're doing it in a way that's opening the club face. So when you swing through and you stop in this position, your club face is pointing up to the sky. That's no good. That's an open club face. So we have the shaft behind the lead arm, but we have a club face that's far too open. You'd need to twist. You need to learn the flexion, the twisting of the shaft to get the club back into this neutral condition. And equally, I watch golfers who struggle hitting the ball to the left a lot. Their follow through looks like this. Club face is pointing down to the ground and the shaft has overtaken the lead arm. So what you'd want to do is practice the stop point, the finish point of your swing. Because if you're familiar with what this feels like in terms of body motion, arm swing and wrist action, if you're familiar with where to stop and how much twist to impose on this grip, you're going to be much more likely to be able to recreate that when it comes to hitting the ball. Just because this happens very, very quickly in the bottom of the swing here doesn't mean you can't have a sense of how twisted and how turned this club should be. And then you can use that reference after hitting balls to give you feedback on whether you did enough of this or not enough, depending on your problem. So this drill is perfect for anyone out there who either has the club face too open or too closed, because you can manage the amount of twisting, add more, take some away, based on your specific issue. So if I was going to hit that shot at the golf range, I'd practice the down feeling with the club face, a little bit of that flexion, and I'd swing into the follow through, stopping where my arms are parallel to the ground, this club's parallel to the ground, and the club head is twisted to the point where that leading edge is vertical. And if I do that a few times and try to stop, I get a sense of exactly where I want to be in the follow through. And then I can go ahead and hit a shot, trying to recreate that same feel. This will generally cause me to have a little bit more draw on my balls, which I know for many of you this will help. And that might be counterintuitive in terms of the idea that not rolling the club face will not produce a draw. It's quite the opposite. You do not need to roll the club face or twist the club face in order to make the ball curve to the left. That swing was pretty good in terms of the wrist angles. I know that I had that 16 degrees of extension at setup, which was fairly consistent with that 20 degrees we saw earlier. Then at the top, 6 degrees of flexion, which is pretty much the flat condition we talked about as well. Then coming down to impact, I'd increased that flexion or that twist a little bit more. That allows me to have the shaft leaning forward and at the same time have the club face square rather than open. That's a problem I see a lot, so I'd encourage you to work on that one. Whenever I do this drill, I'm always trying to see the balls curve a little bit more from right to left. I think that's a good feeling to have, but that would be the way to practice. Now, if you over curved it, the next time I practice this feeling in the follow through, if I'm hitting too much to the left, my feel would be that the face is just a little bit more open. What does that look like? So if I'm hooking these balls still with this current feel, I'm going to get to this same point in the follow through and I'm just going to feel like my face stays more up to the sky. I'm going to reduce the amount of closing. That would be applicable if you hit the ball too much to the left. And equally, if you're doing this exercise and you find that you're still hitting those balls off to the right, guess what you're going to do? You're going to swing through to that same point in the follow through, and instead of that face being vertical, you're going to impart more flexion, more twist, so that this club face is pointing a little bit more down without the shaft disappearing around you. Those are some key drills for you to play with. Think about the Goldilocks experiment. Too much, too little, just right. When it comes to wrist angles, you need to explore the range of possible wrist angles to be able to find your happy place somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. If you're hitting to the right and you're slicing, practice turning the club down as much as you possibly can and seeing how closed you can get this club face before returning back to something more neutral. Equally, if you're hooking the ball, what would the most open club face feel like? Could you do that and make the ball start to go to the right before you take some of that out and bring things back to the middle? Those would be my key recommendations for you to try next time you're at the range. Take a look at those checkpoints, film your swing, and experiment with that different range of flexion extension based on your personal problem. I promised you I'd talk about the grip before I let you go, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. How you place your hands on the club matters to the extent of these arms and wrists have a certain range of motion. What does that really mean? So if I was to put my hand around and my grip on the club here with the most amount of extension and turn in my forearm that I could possibly have, it leaves me practically zero room to twist the club more open. However, it leaves me a huge range of motion in which to twist the club more down or closed. I can make that club twist through 180 degrees. That's a lot of closing, but I can't make it go the other way because I've maxed out my range of motion in my hand, my left hand in this example, and then oftentimes a turned left hand would be associated with a right hand that's underneath. This is typically called a strong grip, and the strong part of it isn't referring to how strong or weak you're holding it. It doesn't refer to the firmness of your grip. The strong reference is to the fact that this strengthens the club face. Turning the club to the left for a right-handed golfer de-lofts the club face and makes it stronger. So this type of grip would typically be associated with someone who can't keep the face square and would close the club face too much. You may already have guessed the opposite of that would be if I move the wrist to maximum the other way, flexion, and I had my forearm turned in the opposite direction. Now I've got very limited, almost zero range of motion to close the face, but I could open this thing up, again, almost at 180 degrees. That's useful information because you can take this idea and move your hands around the grip in order to fit your shot shape. If you're a slicer, you could very well benefit from taking those hands and turning them more to the right, adding more of the forearm and wrist twist at the beginning so that once you grip the club, it's easier for you to feel this closing, this twisting, the flexion that we talked about. Equally, if you're someone who hooks the ball, take that grip, move your hand more to the left, both hands would be more on top of the grip. Now the twisting close part of this equation becomes a little bit more difficult. but it's much easier for me to hold the face open. So the grip is a variable. You only need to look on the PGA or LPGA tour every week to see that not everybody is gripping this club the same. Bryson's grip would be someone who barely can see one knuckle on his lead hand, which is not very much at all. And then you've got players who have the grip turned excessively to the left. Matthew Fitzpatrick would be a great example of that. Matt Fitzpatrick's lead hand and Bryson DeChambeau's lead hand are turned, I would say, more than 90 degrees different on the club. And they're both in the top 10 players in the world. So that should tell you that while grip is important, it doesn't have to be a specific way. It has to fit your shot shape. It has to fit your pattern. Once again, the Goldilocks experiment will teach you how much or how little of this to do. Be brave, try these wide ranges of different grips next time you practice and see the effect it has on your club face and ultimately on your shot shape. I hope the video helped to clear up some ideas around how to control the club face, get it more square at impact based on your individual problem. The control of the club face issue is a large problem to get your arms around. So make sure before you go that you check out the links in the description to other video drills that will help you master your wrist mechanics.